All right, here we go. We're going to start talking about the original 13 English colonies. All right, but to do that, we got to go back, start with the first two, Roanoke and Jamestown. We know Roanoke was the first colony to start, but it disappeared, never really got going. Jamestown had quite a bit of trouble, as we know. They were founded in 1607 on the James River off Chesapeake Bay. We all know the story of the first 110 colonists, only 38 survived. All right, but we're going to talk about the rest of the southern colonies. That includes Maryland, North and South Carolina, as well as Georgia. So we're going to jump into Maryland. Go on down. Started by a man named Lord Baltimore. You should recognize the name. Baltimore, Maryland, one of its key cities, named for its founder, Lord Baltimore. It was established as a Catholic refuge. Catholics in England were not welcome. Most British were Protestant, and Protestant and Catholic really didn't get along. They passed something called the Toleration Act, which caused for religious acceptance, religious tolerance for all different religions in Maryland. Their economy, like most other southern colonies, their economy was based on farming, agriculture, and specifically tobacco. The Carolinas were originally one colony known as Carolina, settled by a bunch of settlers from Barbados. The first town that they settled was Charlestown, which is now Charleston, South Carolina. But with all the constant fighting coming from the Spanish in the south, the French out west, and Native Americans, they called for help from the king. So the king took over the colony, split it in half, sent over two royal governors to control each side, and that became North and South Carolina. Very simple beginning. Now we move down to Georgia, founded by one of my favorite names in history, James Oglethorpe. Just fun to say. It was a refuge for debtors. Now they did this because they wanted Georgia to be a buffer zone. And what does that mean? It means that, well, the Spanish were just south of Georgia here in Florida. The French are out west in Louisiana, not far off. And there are Native Americans all around. And Georgia, there is a gap in the mountains, right in the southern portion, which makes it real easy for people to come in, like the French, the natives, and the Spanish. So Georgia, they wanted to use as a buffer zone from those foreign enemies. So they brought debtors, who were people who had been thrown in prison because they owed money, specifically to the king. But in those days, if you owed money and you could not pay it back, you were thrown in jail. You were a criminal. And so they filled the colony of Georgia with these debtors and the military as a way to preserve and protect the other 12 colonies. Just a quick recap of the southern colonies. In terms of religion, most were Christian, but they were open and tolerant of other religions, especially Maryland. All the economies, southern colonies were based on farming, agriculture, and the biggest crop, tobacco. And the reason that the southern colonies were able to focus on farming year-round was the climate. Hot, humid summers, warm, mild winters. They could farm year-round. As opposed to their counterparts in the north, New England, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Maine and Vermont will come in later. Maine at this point was a part of Massachusetts, and as was part of Vermont, and the other part of Vermont was part of New York, and we'll get there in a little bit. The original inhabitants of New England were, as you guys know them, the Pilgrims, but they're actually a bunch of separatists who wanted to separate from the Church of England. So they left for America, funded by the Virginia Company. They landed in Massachusetts, Plymouth, Massachusetts, in 1620. They were knocked off course. They were supposed to go to Virginia. They were supposed to go to Jamestown, and they couldn't. There was a hurricane out in the Atlantic. They were knocked off course, and they ended up in northern United States and in Massachusetts. When there, they wrote something called the Mayflower Compact, which was a set of laws agreed upon by all males. Yes, all males. Sorry, ladies, you didn't get a say. And that was one of the first examples of self-government in America. Because had they landed in Virginia, Virginia already had government and laws established in the House of Burgesses. But in Plymouth, there was nothing, so they had to establish their own. It was illegal, but what other option did they have? They were stuck. Winter was fast approaching. Now they did meet Samoset and Squanto, two Native Americans who happened to speak English. And they only happened to speak English because they had been kidnapped by English sailors years earlier and forced to work on their ships where they learned English. But they were able to negotiate a peace treaty with Chief Massaset, the chief of the tribe, and the Pilgrims, also the separatists. They taught them how to farm, hunt, and fish, and sometime in late October, they celebrated their feast, their harvest, and that became the first Thanksgiving. That was the groundwork for it. And once the separatists set up a colony there, more followed, especially the Puritans. And the Puritans, like the separatists, had a problem with the Church of England, but whereas the separatists wanted to just separate from the church, the Puritans wanted to purify the church. They thought it was corrupt, and they're probably right. But they came to America in 1630 in something called the Great Migration. They had it figured out. They came over with 11 ships, fully stocked, 1,000 passengers. They did it right. They came over with all the supplies they would need. They came over, they set up their colonies and their towns, and they were set up by church congregations. Because to Puritans, church was everything. Church was life. The church ran their life, and their life was run by the church. And their way of thinking, their government, their lifestyle became known as the New England way, the New England way. But they were not tolerant of anyone else. They came here for religious freedom, but they were not willing to give it to anyone else. If they differed from them in any way in terms of religion, they had to leave. Thomas Hooker was forced out. He left Massachusetts in 1639 and went up to the Connecticut Valley, where he established the Connecticut Colony and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which was his government, his form of government. Roger Williams had the same issue. He went to Rhode Island, where he set up the first Baptist church in America. Anne Hutchinson, she could have been put to death for her beliefs. She believed that a person could worship God without a church, a minister, or a Bible. And believe me when I say in those days, not only was she a woman speaking out, which was against the rules and totally taboo, she spoke out against the church. That was grounds for death. The fact that they just excommunicated her and kicked her out of the colony, well, she got off easy. Things were so strict there that they really got into it with the Native Americans, because not only were they strict, but they were expanding and they were taking over land. And to the Puritans and to most Europeans, we believed that we own the land. This is ours. Native Americans, they thought we all shared it. It belonged to all of us. Well, that didn't really go, the two ideologies really don't fit well together. So they met with the Wampanoag chief, Metacom, but they couldn't quite remember his name or pronounce it properly, so they just called him King Philip. Not exactly a nice way to handle it, but that's a story for another day. Now, war broke out between the Wampanoags and the Puritans over land control. Wampanoags lost the war. They got completely destroyed. Whatever Wampanoags survived the war were sold into slavery or forced into labor. And, well, we all know what happens to we all know what happens to Native Americans when they're forced to work in and around Europeans. Most of them, I guarantee, got sick from disease and died, or they ran away and were able to hide. But the strictness of the Puritans really backfired on them later on. And in Salem, Massachusetts, a few young girls kind of got a little creative, and their imaginations got the best of them because, Puritan kids weren't allowed to use their imaginations. They worked sunrise to sunset. They worked all day, every day. There was no fun. There was no enjoyment for these kids. Young girls had to work with their mothers, cooking, cleaning, sewing, weaving in the house. Young boys had to had to farm, hunt, do things outside with their fathers. Left really no time for imagination, but especially for the girls, because when the boys were out hunting and fishing, well, they were able to daydream a little bit. The girls were so regimented, it almost, it did do some damage to them. Now, there was a slave by the name of Tituba. She was from Barbados, and she started telling these girls stories, scary stories, ghost stories, specifically centering around her religion, voodoo. The girls' imagination went wild, and they started to pretend to be bewitched and started accusing others of being witches and harassing them and poking them and pricking them through magic. Over 100 people are accused and arrested. 20 of them are executed. 19 of them being hung. That one other was a gentleman who was pressed to death, was literally crushed by rocks, trying to get him to confess being a witch. It was a horrible time in New England, something that most New Englanders, especially in the Salem area, they really don't like to talk about because it's kind of embarrassing to think that they were so ignorant and so blind to just kids' silliness and stupidity. To recap New England, the religion. They all came here for religious freedom, but they were so strict and unadapting to anyone else's religion or anyone else's ways. Their economy was based primarily on fishing and whaling. It was too cold during the winters, and there was not a lot of good farmland. It was hilly, rocky, so they made their living on the ocean, fishing and whaling. Their climate, hot, humid summers, but cold, harsh winters. And now we're going to go to the middle, literally the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Now, New York wasn't always New York. It started off as New Netherlands. Originally, they were settled by the Dutch. Remember that little sliver on your map from colonization? That was the Dutch. All right, they used something called the patroon system, where a boat captain would be paid money to bring colonists over to New Netherlands to live. This way, those people didn't have to pay to come over. The government paid the boat captains. And so if they brought at least 50 people over, they'd be paid a wage to do it. Peter Stuyvesant was the governor of New Netherlands. Now, if you look at the arrow at his leg, you'll notice something's missing. Yes, his leg. It was actually shot off in a fight with the Spanish. And the guy was weird to begin with. But after his leg was blown off, he actually it said that he had a funeral for his leg and had it buried out in the Caribbean. Weird guy. Now, New Netherlands didn't last very long. The King of England felt that as a threat. Now, he wasn't afraid of the Dutch, but he had his colonists up in New England, Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Separatists, the Puritans, but they're still British citizens, and he had Virginia. And now they were cut off from each other. So he wanted New York. He wanted that Hudson River Valley to keep that open, because if the Dutch got upset, they could shut that down, and that would disrupt trade and communication. So he has his younger brother, the Duke of York, James, go into New Netherlands and get the Dutch out. Not a single shot's fired. The Dutch settlers could stay there. They just wanted the Dutch government out. They could stay too, but no longer under Dutch rule. It would become English rule. New Netherlands becomes a proprietary colony of the Duke. The Duke owns it, and he names it for his hometown, York, England. Now it becomes New York. New Jersey used to be a part of New York, but he decided to give it to his friends George Carteret and John Berkeley as a gift. Hey, here's a couple of 100 acres, a couple of 1,000 acres of land. Have fun with it. New Jersey, like New York, offered religious freedom, large plots of land set for settling, for farming. New York and New Jersey had some pretty good farmland. Jersey better than New York, and a whole lot of fishing ports and trade ports. Now we go on to Pennsylvania, settled by a man named William Penn. Now, Penn was the son of a British admiral, and the king actually owed Penn's father quite a bit of money, but his father passed away. So the king made good on his promise, but instead of giving the family the money, he offered William Penn this huge plot of land out in the New World, because after all, William Penn was a Quaker, which was a religion that was, well, kind of weird. They got their name Quaker because when they would pray, they would literally shake and quake when praying. That's why people called them Quakers. And most Quakers were discriminated against in England. So when the king said, hey, you got this huge plot of land, why don't you take all your Quaker friends with you? William Penn didn't look twice. He took the land, got a lot of his friends together, and they went over to the New World and set up Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods, excuse me, and they lived there quite happily. Now, the Quakers were very friendly, especially the Native Americans, very open and accepting. Now, you should be going through your documents, and the yellow folder, there's two pictures. There's a picture and a document, both of which are from William Penn about his relationship with the natives. That's something you should be looking at. They were very kind, very good to them. This is why the city of Philadelphia, where William Penn first landed in Pennsylvania, is known as the city of brotherly love. Because in Quaker religion, you called everyone your brother, and they believed in love. And not in a weird way, but just a respectful way. That's why Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. It may not be that much anymore, but that's the origins. But if you look at William Penn and you think about his religion, something may come to mind. Yeah, Quaker oatmeal. Now, if you ask the people at Quaker, is that William Penn? Of course, they'll deny it because they owe him a ton of royalty to his family, his estate. But no mistake about it, the Quaker oatmeal man is very reminiscent of William Penn and a typical Quaker in those days. Delaware started out as part of Pennsylvania. It was the southern three colonies. They were so separated, William Penn granted them their own assembly, their own government. And as time went on, less and less communication, they eventually just became Delaware. It wasn't a nasty thing. It was just a geographic thing. So, recap the middle colonies. The religion was open and tolerant of other religions, especially in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Their economy was very diverse. Farming, shipbuilding, mining, trading. The climate was hot, humid summers, cold, harsh winters. Okay? And this should look familiar to you. There were Native Americans scattered all throughout North America. Spanish were in the west, further west as well, beyond Louisiana, and in Florida. France was right in the middle of the United States, and a good portion of Canada. So there were a lot of people in the area. That's why Georgia was established as that military buffer zone, to keep the Spanish and the French and the natives out. But we were not alone here. And by we, I mean Europeans. The natives were here, and they were here in force, and they were here originally. So make sure you've taken some notes. Make sure you especially take notice of some of the big names, the environment, the religion, and the economies.